Hey, everybody. Before we get started, I want to thank my friends at Hatch for producing this episode. You can get unlimited podcast editing and strategy for one flat rate by visiting hatch.fm. All right, let's get into the show. Welcome to Distribution First, the show where we flip content marketing on its head and focus on what happens after you hit publish. Each week, I share playbooks, motivations, stories, and strategies to help you repurpose and distribute your content because you deserve to get the most out of everything you create.
A new tribe is forming. Thousands apply, but only 18 are chosen to be abandoned in Fiji for the adventure of a lifetime. Who will have what it takes to outwit, outplay, and outlast all the rest?
Justin, how are you?
Awesome, man. Whenever I get to come on and chat Survivor, which is rare, it's amazing. So I'm happy to be here.
Need distribution, so we're going to talk a bunch about that, repurposing, your video course that you put out, all sorts of cool stuff, and of course, lots and lots of Survivor. Justin, why the heck did you pick Survivor to talk about today?
So Survivor is my, I guess, not so guilty pleasure of a show. It's been running forever, so super popular still. It's not Housewives or something that I'm guilty pleasure watching, but for me anyway, it's something that I did not enjoy until I sat down and binge watched it all during the pandemic. And then it's honestly one of the few shows outside of sports that I watch anymore on like a regular cadence. That, it's one of the rare things that isn't bingeable. They still show it live on Wednesdays on network television. You have to tune in and watch it. And so for me, I think it's kind of a throwback experience to do that.
So have you seen all of them?
I have seen every episode, I'm pretty sure. If not, it would be like 98% of the episodes I've seen.
And do you watch any like spin-off type stuff? Anything Survivor you're going to watch?
That's probably more my family, but for me, I really enjoy just the core of the show. But my wife's like big into following all the ex-Survivor folks on Instagram or seeing like what the theories are for this and that in the background and all that stuff. I stick to the show.
And then do you watch any other type of survival type game show or survivalist content?
No, it's funny because I was just talking about this with somebody. Like Alone is also a very popular show where people get thrown out, and it's a definitely different style game and different style show. But for me, it's just Survivor for some reason. I think it's the whole mode of the show and how it works, and the characters is character driven. We'll get into that probably at some point. But I think for me, it's fun. It's not taxing. It's nothing like typically I'm the type of person who's like reading nonfiction books and like getting better and trying to do all those things. So it's an actual like step away in my life to like, there's nothing productive about watching Survivor other than entertainment value.
Yeah, it's escapist for sure. I love Alone and I don't watch Survivor regularly, but yeah, it's a completely different show. Also escapist, but yeah, completely different. But it's funny because you could say like they're both survivalist type shows, but really it's super different, obviously.
Yeah. One is like Survivor extreme. Like Alone is like real, like not that the people on Survivor aren't surviving, but
well, yeah, Survivor is, you're trying to outsmart, outlast.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas Alone, it is just you're descending into madness and starving yourself to death. And it's just how long you can take it.
Yeah, I was joking with somebody that if I was on Alone, I would be like the madman talking to himself within like the first hour because I can't. I'd be like, just get me out of here. I can't be with my thoughts this long.
Yeah, I would like to think based off of sort of a fair amount of survivalist training from time in the army and otherwise that I would be like at least okay. And I would get so cold immediately and I would tap out because I'd be too cold without a doubt. Unless I'd have to be somewhere hot, like give me somewhere super hot and I'd be set. But if it's not somewhere like even remotely cold, which they pretty much only do cold places. But anyways, we're talking about Survivor today. Zooming out, tell us about Distribution First.
Yeah, Distribution First started as a podcast. It still is a podcast, but that's what I started it as. And really it was taking my methodologies and the way I think about content marketing from 12 plus years of doing this and doing it every which way over those 12 years, from pounding the ground with SEO to doing high level brand stuff at startups to everything in between. And really what that has turned into is a whole philosophy that really is around distribution first, which is starting to really take off in a lot of ways inside content marketing, which is just the understanding of like creating content for the sake of creating content is not good enough anymore. And I think a lot of teams still, they feel the need to hit a drumbeat of production without a why behind that, or a how the audience is going to engage with that, or a reason that it fits in with the larger marketing strategy, business strategy, all that type of stuff. But hey, we're creating content, so we're ahead of the game here. And so I think for me, and what that causes marketers, me experiencing as well, is a lot of stress, a lot of burnout, a lot of just trying to keep that ball rolling up the hill, and then no time or energy or effort to be able to actually step back and be more strategic or be creative or experiment or any of these things that we wanted to do when we started to be marketers, do the fun stuff, try new things, try new formats, because we've got to still pump out all this content. So that was the podcast kind of turned into a framework and a methodology. And then that's now transforming into a membership and a community site where I'm bringing content marketers together to be able to actually build those strategies in-house, build them for their own teams, and then be able to hopefully execute on a cleaner, more effective strategy.
And we're going to dig super into all that in the second half of our episode here today. Meredith, what the heck is Survivor?
So for this one, we're going back to 1988 in England, and we're working with Charlie Parsons.
That is Meredith O'Neill, our amazing producer extraordinaire.
So Charlie Parsons is this British TV producer.
Indeed, that's me.
And at the time he was working on this UK show called Network 7. That was sort of a channel within a channel, really geared towards teens who are kind of like looking at normal TV and being like, this is boring. And so it was supposed to be this like edgy music and news show. And they had to come up with segments for it. And so while brainstorming different segments, one of the researchers, this guy named Murray Boland, suggested, let's put a bunch of celebrities on an island and film them.
It came out of the idea of putting together a mixture of fact, a mixture of game, and the sort of story of a soap opera and drama. Trying to make there be, for instance, a cliffhanger every week, trying to make there be a real structure to what would normally be the documentary that I'd earlier filmed. And that's how it came about.
Charlie Parsons fell in love with this idea. And they actually did convince the Network 7 team to actually fly a bunch of minor celebrities to an island in the Indian Ocean. But according to Variety, the segment went largely unnoticed. So not a great reception, if any at all.
So that idea sort of stayed with me for a bit.
His idea, though, was instead of being a one-off, it had to be a long-running show to be successful. And I wrote serialized content for the win, because I know that's what we're all about. But he said, I did get big interest from Granada, but ITV didn't want to run it as a 13-episode series. I refused to do that, which in hindsight was super brave of me. So this is him standing up. He's like, this is what it needs to be, with absolute conviction, turning down this big network, which is brave. So then finally 1997, which I have to put in context, is nearly 10 years later, right? So it takes a while for this to even get picked up as an idea in the first place. It was a Swedish broadcaster called SVT that ended up taking the show on, but they called it Expedition Robinson, which I thought was kind of hilarious. And they spent £2 million at the time on the show, and it was the most expensive commission in the history of Swedish TV. But by the end of the season, it ended up being their most popular, and they also had other countries looking to make their own spin-offs. So they knew they had something. But Parsons was still I want this to be a US show. So he made this connection in Hollywood, this TV producer named Mark Burnett.
The legendary Mark Burnett.
Yeah, and he was able to convince CBS to pick up the show, which at the time, he was this is good for CBS, because CBS was actually not doing well at the time. It ended up being something that kind of was a saving grace for them. So Charlie Parsons said that Burnett was crucial to the process, obviously, not just because he connected him with CBS, but because of his filming style. So he really brought his own exciting style to the show. And the US series ended up premiering in 2000. So it's been out there for a long time at this point. So this one TV executive from the parent company of Charlie Parsons' company, Castaway, this guy, Lucas Green, so that's a long intro, said that the reason that the show has become so popular is that it has this sort of like winning formula. And that is, it's full of jeopardy and human drama.
Is that part of the problem? That you can't beat him and it frustrates you?
It's fueled by a diverse cast. It's always set in a tropical paradise, synonymous with the show, is what he said. So it's got like all of these like really appealing things that really draw people in. I was just watching the first episode of season 46, I think it is. And it's like draws you in immediately. These people are thrown together. They're strong personalities.
In real life, people think I'm a nut. But out here, I'm about to kill it.
There are people who dress in interesting ways. And they're immediately thrown into like these high stakes challenges that they have to go through. And they're covered in mud immediately. And then they're off to the races. And so it happens really fast. The pacing is really important. And looking back on all of this, like in the end, now that it's been out for 46 seasons, it's won Emmys, has inspired lots of spin-offs, including one called Moolah Beach, which I thought was really funny. And that's the kids version. So features kids instead of adults and is geared towards kids. But looking back, it's like this show it took at least 10 years for it to be picked up in the first place, not even by the sort of audience or the network that Parsons wanted. It had been rejected by the BBC, ITV, and Channel 4. And then I wrote Suckers. It's become this like huge show that's been going on for so long. But the things that I was thinking that like they do really well is that they had this sort of mastermind Charlie Parsons, who had pure conviction that the content just needed to exist, which is something that we've talked about on Remarkable before. So basically, like, if you believe the content should exist, make it. The second thing I took away was like serialized content is way better than one-offs, and it may take time for it to take off. Diversity is super important in the people that are featured in your content.
I'm going to be the very first Persian winner of Survivor because, honey, it is long overdue.
And continue to tweak your content over time because Justin, I know you've mentioned like there have been changes to the show over time as you've seen it, right? And you've seen all of the seasons. So how have you seen the show change over time and what has really kept you watching it?
The show has changed a lot. And it's funny when you think about it. In some ways, it hasn't changed at all. And in other ways, it's changed monumentally. When you watch some of the older seasons, you were talking about the fast pace of like you diving into episode 1 of season 46. If you dove into episode 1, season 1, you'd be like, this is the slowest, most boring show on the planet. How are we watching this right now? It's the pacing, the cuts, the way it's shot. Like everything is so different. And they've really, I mean, obviously after 24 years, they've honed into their formula and how that works. But even the show, the game has changed. It used to be a 30 some odd day, I think 36 day, and now it's down into the 20s. And so even just the amount of days that people are out there together has changed. It's changed how long these people get to know each other. It's changed how long people can, because it's the same number of people. So the game is just shorter. They get rid of people a lot faster. And they've changed how people make it to the finals. That's changed over the years. So even who can be the winner has essentially changed over the years. And so they've done enough changes to keep it interesting. But I think if you were to say that the heart of the show has basically been the same over those 20 some odd years.
It's so obvious in retrospect that this wouldn't work as a pilot, right? And it is so funny that they try a segment within a show, and that exact thing, Celebrities on an Island, is like not half of the shows on TV, but basically like a ton of shows on TV is that exact thing. Like this is what Love Island is. This is like a bunch of that sort of stuff, which again is not a short thing. It's not a bunch of celebrities spend, an afternoon on an island. They spend a month. And so, it's so funny that this guy had this idea of putting celebrities on an island and it didn't work for a short time horizon. Again, it's so obvious because how could it work, right? You don't build up any drama. You don't build up any tension, like all the things that you don't care about, who wins, because you don't develop a relationship over the time. You miss all like the little moments and the strategizing and strategery that they're using. Again, it's a completely different show. And now we have so many different Survivor type competitions out there, or reality TV shows where people are on an island, or, things like The Challenge, which is, totally different. We have so many different types of shows like this now that are similar, but ultimately different. And Survivor 46 seasons, clearly they figured out how to make it something that works, as a series over and over and over again and gives you something fresh. It's truly incredible.
I know, it's pretty good.
I mean, they said it's the most successful reality show of all time. And I don't know how it wouldn't. It has 46 seasons. So I don't know what else would be.
I've not done badly, it's true. I say in my British way, I've not done badly. It's been good for me, Survivor.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny because, I've watched some of those other shows, and for me, it's like, I don't know what it is about, like, reality TV is not my thing. Like, that's the funny thing about it. I actually really don't like reality TV all that much. I couldn't even name another show. But for some odd reason, when I go to watch Survivor, it's something that we always come back to, and that's fun and exciting. And I think for whatever magic they've got figured out for all those seasons and be able to come back successfully over and over again, they've definitely cracked the code on that one.
I think it's also really interesting that although it has changed, with Outplay, Outlast is like enduring, right? I mean, they had that season 1. That's like the goal, right? And that's what you come back for over and over and over again. How often do people in tech or otherwise, you come up with your company name, you come up with your company tagline, and then you change it to do a bunch of different stuff later. And they've had the same thing more or less for 46 seasons. Like, that is freaking incredible, right? They nailed it that well at the beginning. We say it's the promise to the listener, right? It is the exact thing that you get every episode. You get to watch them either outwit, outplay or outlast, the competition. And they nailed it.
I outsmarted him. I outfoxed him. And at the moment, sorry to say, I'm out leading him.
Yeah, and that's actually judging criteria at the end of the show. Like, when you go, like, the final 3 has to present their case to the jury, who then votes on who wins. Like, that's how they choose who wins.
Losers, tribal council, somebody will be voted out and become the 8th and final member of the jury.
And there's the 3 categories that each player gets judged on. And so when you're going out there, ultimately you have to play a game that fits all 3 of those criteria, or play a game in which you can try to convince those members. Because ultimately it's not America who likes you the best, or even your 2 friends on the tribe, or you playing the best game. Honestly, there's people who've played better games and have lost and have been really, really, like, devastatingly upset live on national television because they were the better player, but they backstabbed everybody. And so the jury didn't vote them, and they lost out on $1 million, even though they played the best game. And so again, like, there's the layers to the drama in this show are just amazing. And so I think there's sort of an unpredictability that really anything can happen, especially at the end. Like, you're building to this point, and then somebody might lose a challenge or win a challenge and be able to propel themselves to the final right at the end, even though they were struggling the whole time. So it's a really interesting way that they've built the show up.
Yeah, and I think the utility of the show truly is a game show. It is a game show. Alone is not a game show. Although it is a game, it is a survivalist show. It is like, it's teaching you how these different people survive in the wild. And then it's a look at man versus self, or woman versus self, right? It's like, it's a fight inwardly because you're not competing with the other people. You're just trying to survive, right? By yourself. And so, and I've binged all of the seasons of Alone. So in a similar way. And that's why I bring it up here. But it's a completely different utility for the listeners. Yeah, I care who wins for sure. I have characters that I root for on Alone, but it's just a very different thing than in Survivor, because the element that you said, which is you don't control your outcomes. Your peers have a vote. These other people have a vote.
You were voted out seconds into the game.
You can play it, quote unquote, right. I think that there's something about that is so refreshing to people, that it's not always decided by just the person who is the fastest or can jump the highest or, whatever, which is what a lot of game shows are, that it has this other element to it. And I think that that's like the magic of what has made it last, amongst many other things, for so long. It's consistent. It's repeatable. You always know what you're getting. You always get the same thing. And it has this finale where there's like these rules. And if you follow the rules, you probably put yourself in a best place to win. And it's different every time.
Yeah, and it really is an interesting game because there's social players, there's physical players, there's people who are really good just making friends with other people and bringing other groups together and being a connector. Like there's all these different, like, strength is not just one thing. It can be multifaceted. And so the players being able to utilize their strengths and try to play the game in a way that is smart and sets them up for, it really is a game of strategy as well. I think, tying into marketing and things like that as well, it really is a game of strategy and trying to be 2 or 3 steps ahead and get ahead of the other players so that when you do set yourself up for that move, you're putting yourself in a good place to succeed and not one false move and you're now at the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah, and it's a zero-sum game, right? So it's like there has to be a winner.
Yeah.
And they're all competing for that. Yeah, it's great. It's a great premise. And it's super simple to understand. And, if you're sitting at a bar and you're saying, hey, I watched this show, and you're like, what's it called? And you're like, it's called Survivor. They send a bunch of people to an island, and whoever makes it as the final one is the one who wins $1 million. It's pretty darn simple to explain.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing too there for me is like I watch it with my kids. And so there's not a ton of things, probably very few things actually, that we would all like watch together as a family and truly enjoy. They've got their things they like. I've got my things I like. Maybe sometimes they're going to sit down and watch a football game with me. Maybe sometimes I'm going to watch Blue with them. But it's not like everybody's excited to sit down and watch the show. And so the fact that we can all do that together is fun too.
Little 4-quadrant TV show action.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who doesn't like that? And you can't share winnings. There's no conspiring to share winnings.
Right.
You can't do it. Forbidden. So somebody does have to win. Can't chop the pot, which I think is also a key rule. All right. What are some marketing takeaways from Survivor?
One of the biggest ones for me that you kind of mentioned was along the idea of just longevity and even repetition. So they've got this core to the show that has stayed true, and they really understand the why behind what they're doing. Why does this show exist? What are our core purposes, values, all those type of things? Who's the audience that we're serving with this show? I think they're very, very aware of who watches Survivor. And especially after all these years with as large of an audience as they have to be aware of those things. And I think for marketers, and again, marketers aren't always the drivers in all these things. So there's a larger business model as well. But being able to understand who that audience is and then just serve that audience to the best of their ability over time and do it in a way that not feeling like every single month or quarter or year we have to come up with the brand new thing and make it, nice and shiny. And I think there's something to be said, especially in today's world, with consistency over time. And there's always going to be this shiny new thing. There's always going to be a new show that comes. There's always going to be a slate of new shows that come out every fall. Happens every year. There's going to be a new show. And yet here we are 24 years later and Survivor's still standing up. So I think there's something to be said just for pure, like, knowing who you're serving, knowing what kind of content you do create. Again, they're not in 2024 trying to make a completely different show. It is still true to what it is, even though it's 24 years later. So yeah, that consistency, longevity, and then just staying to who you are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all that. One other thing that sort of strikes me as interesting about this is people always like to learn about new places in the world. And so we don't do this a lot in our marketing in B2B, but people really are interested in Borneo or Pagong or, Australia or all these places. And we always like a little cabana on the ocean, right? Like we always like that sort of castaway island setting is, for whatever reason, we love it. And I don't know if there's a way to input that in your marketing, but I think that the idea of teaching people about locations, like specifically when you're thinking about customers, like it's something that we never really incorporate into our storytelling is like, if you have a customer that's headquartered in Detroit or Denver or whatever, that headquarters is somewhere, there's something about it, there's something unique there. And I wonder if there's a way that you could paint the picture a little bit better so that you're teaching people about these places. Because I imagine, we didn't know what the Cook Islands were, or we didn't know about Micronesia or Samoa or some of these places intimately like we potentially do after we watch the show.
I think it's interesting too, because I think there's something with that is it's not just any old place. They're not thrown in, and now they actually don't even change. Like for the last, I don't even know how many years, it's Fiji. They're in Fiji all the time. Like, even though you don't want to really be on a Survivor, you're like, I wouldn't mind being there at sunset, and they show that one, the opening scene or something like that. So there's something aspirational and inspiring about the locations and where they're at as well, where it's just like, that'd be really cool to visit there. Or they'd take them on a helicopter ride, around the X, Y, and Z place, or to a waterfall down in a particular place in the world. And so I think even though you don't want to be in Fiji when the storms are rolling in and it's pouring rain, you have no shelter, and there's maybe some level of pleasure watching these people suffer because they signed up for that and you didn't. But I think there is something to be said, even within our marketing, to be sort of aspirational and make people want to inspire to a different level and inspired to be, maybe a better version or a different version of themselves as well.
I wonder if Fiji pays for that, for the placement, or at least gives them some sort of discount or something that why they would go back there, right?
I think it's probably multiple. I think Fiji does do some things for them, and I'm pretty sure Jeff Probst lives there. I think it's a twofer in that case.
Yeah, which brings me to my next point. Never underestimate the power of the evangelist. Our guy, Jeff Probst, really, you can't think about Survivor without Jeff. Much like Pat Sajak or the late, great Alex Trebek, they add some element, like the game show host is so important to, the process. They are the continuity, but you don't go there and watch it for the game show host. And I think that that's like what a lot of people get wrong when they create a series or they're creating content, or they have like this role of an evangelist, or they have, their CEO or C-level executives doing content. They don't have to always be a star. Jeff Probst, I don't think you would say is a star. Like, I think Alex Trebek was a star. But Jeff, I think that he is fantastic, but I think you can make a pretty good case that he is just there to keep the trains running on time and to be that sort of consistent presence there. And he occasionally has to crack the whip and, do some things like that. But I think that so often B2B companies think that their CEO or C-level executive has to be some like super dynamic, superstar, amazing personality that can just crush every interview and do all this stuff. Like, chances are you're probably not going to have that, but you could have someone that is just consistent and reliable and repeatable, and that works too.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point too, even with the content and work. I think in an ideal state, when you have that sort of charismatic, one way or the other, leader, we see these companies and we sort of want to emulate the Apples and the Teslas and the Microsofts, even though those people might not have Amazon. I mean, you think about all these companies with either people who became dynamic leaders. I don't think Bezos was necessarily a dynamic leader back when he started Amazon, but he's sort of become this dynamic leader. Somebody like Steve Jobs obviously had a lot of good to go, with some of the bads that Steve Jobs had. But when you're talking about hosting a show or doing content, you don't have to be a superstar, but I think you have to kind of understand your role in it and be that. Maybe your role is that consistent voice who can, in a solid effort here and there, and provide value and be the glue to the show or a glue to the content. But you don't have to be the person that's actually running the ship and being the end all be all of the show. And I think Jeff doing that for so many years has kind of proven that formula works. I'm interested kind of like, because like you said, it's a game show at its heart. And a lot of these sort of hosts who do that are sort of like in the game show sphere. For B2B, it's interesting to think about, maybe it's just a shift in formats or a shift in, not that we're going to do a game show in B2B, but that'd be kind of cool maybe. But now you've got me thinking like, what would be an interesting format where we could put a CEO in the role of host that isn't just interviewing people? Because I think that's the default. It's like, we'll make them Seth Meyers, we'll make them Jimmy Fallon, and now they're the late night host, and that's where we pigeonhole them.
Yeah, it just depends on the type of content, the type of format. It could be narrative, it could be them asking the questions, but they don't appear at all in the final cut. We did a show for a while that Meredith was the narrator of, where we would do the interviews and then pull out the host voice, and then she would do essentially all of the connecting narrative. And like, it's just stuff like that like there's so many different ways to do this, where you could still have your C-level executive involved, and yet they don't have to make it in the final cut, or they could make it in the final cut in a different way that you wanted to do it. But yeah, I think that looking at something like Survivor, where Jeff has a very, very specific role that he's set to do, but that role is, he rarely goes outside of that, right? It's like he is there to tee up the conversations, to tee up the competitions, to tee everything up. And any CEO who's worth, darn, probably can do that type of work. And if they commit to it, you can have massive results. We've seen that for sure.
Yeah. And I think we'd be kidding ourselves if they go to tribal council and Jeff is just going in blind, not knowing what's going on and not knowing which questions to ask or which things to pry about, or they've got this formula figured out to where, and obviously it's all done in post as well in the editing, but they do such a good job of truly telling a story without you even realizing it sometimes. Like I'll be in it and then I'm like, oh, they're setting this up. Like you can watch it in live happen, like this person and this person. It's foreshadowing. Like, why are they like showing this a little bit of a tiff here? And then it's like, oh, well, because now at Tribal, this thing is going down and they pieced that spot together to make that happen. And then, oh, by the way, Jeff just happens to ask a question that really drills into that piece of that and makes that thing happen. So it's interesting to see how they format everything and figure those things out. But I think, yeah, to your point, you can set the CEO up to be able to do particular things like that. You can take the CEO out and just edit it and post and make it still tell that same story and make it sound really, really good and really, really interesting.
Any other final Survivor thoughts or marketing lessons or takeaways?
Probably the last one for me is just the idea of being willing to adjust on things when they're no longer valid or no longer working. So truly, there are probably seasons or episodes of the show that if you tried to replay today would be super cringy. The conversation, because culture was different and there's just a lot of things that are different over a 25-year span. But I think them being able and willing to adjust and shift and make not necessarily wholesale changes, but be able to maneuver and be willing to shift and change things as needed, I think is key. Because sometimes as marketers, it's easy to put our foot in the ground and say, this is what we've done, this is what we've always done, and this is what we're going to keep doing. Or on the flip side, like we touched on earlier, it's easy to get shiny object syndrome and go every which way. So I think my biggest lesson from Survivor is just that staying true to who you are and being able to create something that is really long lasting and not a flash in the pan. There's lots of flash in the pan in marketing as well. And so how do we build up plans? How do we build up things? How do we keep saying the same things over and over and talking about those things in a way that resonate, adjusting angles, switching things? I've been doing this with my stuff for 4 years. If you told me that I could talk about repurposing and distribution and content marketing every day for 4 years, are you kidding me? That's thousands of days of content on this. And yet somehow I figured out how to manage that. So that's my biggest lesson coming from Survivor.
I couldn't agree more. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they're trying to make a show and you say, okay, let's do a pilot for 10 episodes. And then someone will say, well, our CFO really, we can't commit to 10. Maybe, do you think we should start with 6? Or maybe like 4. And I get that there's budget constraints. I get all that stuff. So not that that's not valid. That is super valid. But what you should be thinking about is, how do we build 100 episodes? Because that's where you will win. If you get to 100, you look at the rarefied air that you're in if you get to 100 episodes of a series. Like there's virtually no company that I've talked to, unless they're doing a couple things like really bad. If you have any type of audience growth and you've sort of hit 100 episodes, like you're probably going to end up being at a minimum in a different category than the rest of folks out there. And when people say like, okay, I want to do 6 episodes or I want to do 4 or whatever, that's all we can do. This isn't going to be a show. That's not what a show is. You could do a mini series and then you need to go back to the drawing board and rethink exactly what you're doing, because a mini series has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a thing that you're trying to do. So it's something completely different. You could do that. And then you could say, hey, let's make a mini series and then let's launch your show after the mini series saying, hey, this was popular. We want to continue this going in a more episodic format. But so many people, they can't get past the pilot, and shows just don't work like that. How many people caught the episode 4 of a show and then you just like happen to get no, you don't do that. You come in at season 5 and then you go, oh, I'm going to binge all the back stuff. Or you come into a show at, episode 217. Yeah, I'm not going to go listen to 200 episodes of this show. I just want the most recent stuff. And probably that interviewer is way better and probably the show is more streamlined and probably they've learned a lot of lessons from that and it's better than it was then. And so there's no right answer there, but I think I've never seen a show where they just stop after like 6 episodes and then like see how it worked, end up being successful. It's like way too hard to do that for B2B companies because ultimately like nobody really cares what you have to say. If you close up shop, you didn't make another piece of content for the next 10 years, nobody would be upset about it because the expectation is just not set there that you need to do that. There are business objectives and audience objectives that you're striving to meet, but you launching new stuff is not a requirement for like the rest of the world, right? It's like you need to break out. And to do that, you need distribution.
Well, it's funny. Yeah. And like with a 6-episode series, I mean, that's setting yourself up to fail in that way, right? Like saying, take the miniseries side of it out and things like that. But to say, we're going to do, we'll try 6. If you're just going to try 6, you're probably also not going to put much effort around repurposing the distribution, the marketing of the content that you're creating, because even though you totally should, it's going to make those 6 episodes even better. But I can sense in the mentality and even in the conversations that I've had before, because there's disbelief that that thing is really worth doing. And so if that's the case, then you just have a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point of like, well, I knew it wouldn't work, but you didn't do anything to market it, distribute it, get in front of your audience, make sure they like it, any of those things. You just recorded 6 episodes of a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, if you sat down, if the original pitch to Mark Burnett from our guy was like, hey, let's just try this and see if it works, that's not real. He's thinking like, let's make a show that can make 10, 20 seasons because that is the business model that it's predicated on, is making a hit, right? For us, we don't try to make hits. We just try to make something that's like good enough. And so if you think about it, how do we make a machine that makes 100 episodes so we can have a hit show? What would the effort and energy require to do that? Because I think that the audience needs to learn about this topic and this topic and this topic, and there's not a delivery mechanism for those ideas currently out there, and we have a novel way of thinking about it. Then it's a no-brainer, and you're thinking of how you do it rather than should you do it.
Love that. Yeah. Thinking long-term too, and in terms of like the goal isn't Q4 number increase with this podcast. It's,
right.
You know what I mean? It's a totally different reason for doing a show and to create content, that particular type of content.
Well, and the reason why it matters is because if Justin goes, hey, Ian, do you watch Survivor? And like, I watched it like years ago, but I haven't watched it in a while. And he goes, you should watch season 47. I think you'll love it. I already have a relationship with the show. I already know exactly what the show is. I can tap back into it really easily. And one of my friends just said, go do it. That is why you have a show, right? Is you can bring back old, try it again for the first time, right? Or try it again for the 47th time. That's why you have a series, is so that you can do things like that. So you can have word of mouth spread that way, or you can do things and people can leave and they can get back caught up and new people can join and all those things. You can't do that if you don't have some type of serialized content, that's out there.
Totally agree.
Let's talk distribution. I personally, my philosophy on this is I would not make a piece of content that doesn't have distribution. We put every single episode of a Caspian podcast, almost every single one, has a paid budget behind each episode, because I would not make something. So when people come to me like, hey, I want to make a podcast or whatever, I'm like, do you have the money to promote it? And if they don't, I'm like, I personally wouldn't do it. You can do it, but like organic's not a strategy for me. How do you think about distribution? Obviously, your company's called Distribution First, so you think about it a lot. What's your strategy?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's funny though, because I think coming from B2B and now even running my own thing, like I do 0 paid for my stuff right now. It's all organic. That may change in some days, but it's funny for the companies that I have worked with and talked to. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get ad budget for content that isn't instantly ROI positive. I think when you zoom out and look at the fuller buying journey, life cycle of a customer, funnel, whatever you want to call it, it becomes very clear that that's a mistake and that only, hammering an audience with a bottom funnel message, for lack of a better term, isn't wise, isn't smart. But I think most people have no clue what's happening with the content they create. even really smart marketers that I talk to, all that they have no concept. It's really the irony of it all is very, very thick of like, we're spending so much time and so much effort to create all of these things. And we have no way of knowing how that's getting in front of anybody, if people care, in what ways are we going to use that? How are we going to maybe reintroduce that in that same concept in different formats and in different ways? I think especially for folks who are creating evergreen content, it's a huge miss to not be repurposing and distributing that content. If you made something that was really, really good in Q1, it's going to be really, really good in Q4. Or it might even be still really, really good in Q1 next year. It's funny. In December, I stopped because of a myriad of reasons, but I also wanted to run an experiment where I stopped producing new episodes of Distribution First. And what I did was I was like, all right, I have all these episodes. I have a whole bunch of new people that are in here now that have never listened to episodes from last year. I'm going to go take the top episodes that were early in the year. I'm going to plop them back in the feed. And it was amazing. I didn't have to record new content. I could put that stuff out there. I could share out all the clips again. I could do all that stuff and write about the topics that I had interviewed somebody about in April and write a newsletter about it in December. And so what that allowed me to do is freed me up to not have to worry about running the podcast and doing the rigmarole of a show for that given period. But it also was, I thought about it in a way like, how is this still helpful to the audience? How is this still useful? And how can people still get good, solid information without me having to reinvent the wheel?
I love that. We do a bunch of stuff like that as well. I know you're huge into repurposing. I think that one of the biggest things that we try to teach people when we're building a show is make sure that you have a segment that is a standalone clip creator, right? So like one of the ones we use all the time is in Pipeline Visionaries, we have a segment that's called basically for uncuttable budget items. And then we make a supercut of all the CMO's uncuttable budget items. We make it into a blog post and we make it into, short video clips. And we have not done a good enough job at this at all of getting it out there. But we do these supercut episodes where we put everybody's uncuttable items for the last 10 or so, 12 episodes. And then we put it into one episode so that people can listen to that on the feed. And we've got great feedback from that. And even for me, who did the interviews, and I go back and listen to those uncuttable budget items, and it's so helpful for me. But that's the whole reason the show exists, is to figure out how people are spending their money and how they're not spending their money. And you need the context for the entire show to understand why someone would spend their money that way, if they're an SMB versus enterprise versus whatever. But to have those all in one place is super helpful. And I just think that there's so many things like that you can do that people are not sort of like taking things to the extra mile. And that's what we say all the time here at Caspian is like, there's no traffic on the extra mile. If you go the extra mile with your marketing, with your content, with your customers, your competitors aren't going to do that. They're really not.
No. And I think the thing with that too is it's funny because inevitably, even for myself, it's like, I'm not doing a good enough job. There's always more you can do. I talk a lot about like squeezing all the juice out of the orange or whatever, but like there's always more you can do. There's like, I've got 3 or 4 ideas sitting in the back of my head from these podcasts I did last year. I'm like, I need to like combine all these into this thing. I need to combine all these and they're sitting there and eventually they will happen. But the truth of the matter is that they won't happen unless I write them down and get a plan to take action on them. And so I think that's the key too for a lot of these repurposing efforts, distribution efforts. The reason why I called the formula and the podcast and everything distribution first is because the idea is in a typical marketing content landscape, distribution gets tacked on at the end. Like, all right, We've got the thing. Now what do we do? Who's got what? Versus throwing it at the beginning, distribution first, and thinking through, all right, as we're creating this podcast, as we're creating this monthly event series, what's going to happen once the show goes live? I just did this with a company the other day and we literally mapped out a 6-week before and a 4-week after of their monthly event and what needs to happen and, placed it all out and lined it up to where now they've got a plan for after that event goes live. Here are the blogs that are coming off of it. Here are the LinkedIn clips that are going to come off of it. Here's what we're going to do on YouTube and be able to recycle that every single month. So now they're creating a real engine that they can just kind of repeat and reuse and then adjust as necessary versus like, we did this event. Here's the recording. Let's move on to the next event.
All right, Justin, any final thoughts here on repurposing, on content marketing, ROI of content? Any other stuff you got for us?
I think the final thing, if we were just kind of wrapping on it, is how necessary it is to have a plan for what you're going to do. I think the more people understand, just what distribution channels they have available to them, you don't have to do all of them. So pick one or two that you're really going to hammer in on and get really good at those and make sure your audience is aware that you exist on those channels. That goes back to consistency. So be able to consistently deliver value to the audience on those places. And then I think the other big thing is just having that plan set in place to where you know that you can fill your distribution channels up with any given amount of content. So if you're sending 2 emails a week, if you are creating LinkedIn content, if you're doing YouTube, how much content do you actually need? And then reverse engineering back to that. Because I think a lot of people get themselves stuck on a hamster wheel of creating content because they don't actually know how much content they need.
Justin, wonderful chatting with you. For our listeners, go check out Distribution First. He obviously has a fantastic newsletter for content you can go check out there as well. Justin, any final thoughts? Anything to plug?
I'd say the final thing is if you're interested, obviously you can come check out the membership. That's going to be ramping up here in Q2. But if you're just looking to try to get started repurposing content and want a little bit of a method to be able to do that, that's free. I have a free guide where it literally walks through my entire blog remix method. And you can get that at justinsimon.co/remix. It's free. You can check it out. It walks through, gives you a template to be able to take blog content, turn it into social content in like less than 60 minutes. So,
Justin, fantastic. We will talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Distribution First, and thank you for listening all the way through. I appreciate you so much. And I hope you're able to apply what you learned in this episode one way or another into your content strategy as well. Speaking of strategy, we have a lot of things going on this year that are going to help you build your brand, 10x your content, and transform the way you do content marketing. Make sure to subscribe to the show and sign up for my newsletter at justinsimon.co so you don't miss a thing. I look forward to serving you in the next episode as well. And until then, take care, and I'll see you next time.